Right. A little bit about the Centre for Entrepreneurship at Witts. We were set up just over 5 years ago with funding primarily from the government. And our purpose is really about fostering an entrepreneurial society. And I say that as opposed to creating entrepreneurs per se, the heroic figures. Because when we looked at societies, particularly emerging economies, what's distinct about them is not simply the fact that there are lots of people who make, or a few people who are making lots of money, but broadly across the society, in the public, private, even the civil society space, people are acting entrepreneurially. And we think that's a much more powerful way of creating that critical mass which is required for development, rather than focusing on a few heroic individuals who make tons of money. So our purpose is really about trying to transform society so that it acts more entrepreneurially.
You sure you're not doing it the other way around?
Yeah, it was. Thank you. And the vision is really to be recognized as a node of excellence in social and traditional or commercial entrepreneurship, because we want to influence both policy and the sort of organizational constructs which society generates. And our particular challenge in South Africa, and I think it may be the same in many other places, is the issue of employment creation. You know, whatever else we do in our countries, if we can't put people to work, give them dignity, give them a sense that they can control their destinies, we quite frankly are wasting time. So we have to find ways of using all the entrepreneurial energies of our people so as to create jobs, and that there are many ways in which it could happen, not just the private sector. And in terms of what we're looking to do as a centre, our key thing is that by 2016 we want to be one of the top 5 global thought leaders. And we're not very shy about that ambition. We think that particularly being in South Africa, where we have this almost unique confluence of first, even post-First World infrastructure, and on the other hand, dire poverty, as you know, worse than Kibera in some cases. We're almost a living laboratory for certainly for social enterprise and enterprise development. And so we should be able to take, we have to play a leading position in doing that. By 2014, we're looking to be one of the preeminent centers across Africa. And this is an internal issue. We need to be able to be self-sustaining as an entity not so long from now. And the way in which we're going to do this is, the key for any academic institution, we believe, is research. You have to be able to create either new knowledge or develop new insights. And this is particularly why I'm pleased, Diane, to be here, because as Prof. Harrison pointed out yesterday, there's not enough indigenous research in Africa, particularly in entrepreneurship and definitely in social entrepreneurship. Very, very little. So I'm very keen to develop relationships over the next few days, which could allow us to do some of the things, the joint research, etc. We have to do it. We have to start to create these insights and these knowledge platforms. Academic, which is the usual thing I think most of us look at doing, which is case studies, teaching, etc. And already I've been speaking to a few people here about them coming to do some guest lectureships, etc. Coming from South Africa, we usually are accused of being very arrogant and not wanting to learn anything from the rest of Africa. I must apologize for that on behalf of everyone, and say that certainly in terms of what we're looking to do, we know, for example, that Kenya leads the social entrepreneurial space in Africa. This is where the most innovative stuff is happening. So we're quite keen to learn and exchange knowledge in that respect. The third piece is what we call alumni partnership, which is really about mining the capabilities and the networks which people who've gone through our programs have, and really developing an interactive relationship with them. And the fourth piece is represented by what we're doing today, which is the advocacy piece, which is where we get together and we share knowledge with colleagues and also represent positions and policies to people with influence and power. So those are the 4 pillars which we at the center are using to construct our progress. Okay, that's the propaganda piece finished. Around 2002, 2003, when I left corporate, I was quite struck by some of the changes which seem to be happening, particularly in the political economy of South Africa. And coming from an investment banking perspective, I first tried to get involved in lots of charities because I thought, let me be good and help society. Then I realized there was a structural problem with charities and their ability to grow, the fact that organizationally they're very inefficient in terms of allocation of capital, and they simply didn't generally create sustainable employment. They alleviated problems rather than dealt with the systemic issues. And I got involved with an entity called Gibbs and established their Center for Social Entrepreneurship there, where we created the first social entrepreneurship certificate program, which was looking to take people who were interested in social enterprises, either coming from NGOs or government or private sector, and give them a training so that they could manage and develop social enterprises a lot more rationally than they previously had. But then I discovered that we had another problem, which is that we didn't do research. A lot of this was driven by people who wanted to do good, who felt as if they had an obligation, but it wasn't based on any rational basis, a lot of the stuff which was done. And it's really from there that we've developed a framework. I wouldn't call it, it's certainly not a theory, it's a hypothesis as to what's been happening in our societies and what that means for economic development. And I just wanted to talk it through for a bit. And then, where is she? Sorry. And Bev will take over and deal with some of the detailed, more specific issues around entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship in South Africa and some of the results there. If I were to ask everyone in this room what a social enterprise was, we'd get a very different and totally legitimate answer. And that's probably the first challenge we have in this space, which is that there's very little consensus around what a social enterprise is. Now, I'm putting myself on the line slightly and saying this is what I mean when I talk about a social enterprise. Okay, for me, it's an entity which is looking to provide certain goods and services which generally are non-discretionary, which we have to have, but do it in a way which is financially and operationally sustainable. Now, let me segue for a minute and talk about why we like to use this definition and use what I call a Richard Branson analogy. When Richard Branson wakes up in the morning and says, air travel is very expensive, it's not good value for money, and he creates Virgin Atlantic, he's looking to maximize his financial outcome. But he's looking to do it in a way which respects the environment, which makes people feel good about themselves, etc. So he's looking to maximize the financial piece while bearing in mind the social and the non-financial pieces. And he's acting like a capitalist, a classic capitalist, but doing it responsibly. However, when Richard Branson says, I want to deal with malaria in southern Sudan, okay, but I'm going to use those same skill sets, okay, and try to reduce the incidence of malaria, he's looking to maximize the social outcome, but doing it in a financially and operationally sustainable way. And that for me is that's a social enterprise that he's looking to build. And that's that is the difference, the way in which we approach it. In 2007, 2006 I think, we tried to map what we thought the outcome of a traditional business versus a social enterprise would look like. This is very crude, but this also demonstrates the paucity of real solid research. This wasn't a very representative sample. And what we estimated is that 95% of the outcome of a traditional enterprise was really around the financial outcomes, the financial value, as compared to 25% for what we term the social enterprise. And this really talks to what the objective, the purpose, the mission of the social enterprise is versus the traditional enterprise. But this is certainly an area where I think we can do some very interesting longitudinal, but also multi-site studies across the African continent. Now, there's a specific transition which has happened, which has influenced the growth of social enterprises and even entrepreneurship generally in South Africa, and we think it has some applicability broader than that. And the way we try to represent it is by mapping social capital and financial capital and asking ourselves, what exactly is happening? Now, I think economics 101 the classic trade-off that entities or people either look to maximize financial or the social outcomes. And really, the classic state is built on this model. The classic state, particularly post-Second World War welfare state, really sought to provide a range of social outcomes for people, and had a pact with the private sector that the private sector pays taxes and the state provides social capital. And that is what worked particularly well, especially for European countries, and certainly the early African republics when they became independent. But late 70s, early 80s, as we all know, there was a new approach, a new philosophy around what the state should and shouldn't do. Because in this model, there was very little space really for even NGOs to participate. And they generally stuck to political narratives. And just primarily stuck to political narratives. But then we had the growth of what's classically called the Washington Consensus, which said that the state should reduce its scope of operation. It should withdraw from many sectors. And I know Zambia, for example, went on this with a real relish after Kaunda was defeated. The UK, for example, has very similar experience to this as to many African countries. But what's interesting is what happened in the private sector. Because traditionally the private sector had seen itself as being in a very symbiotic relationship with the state. But that really has been broken. And the private sector has looked to increase its returns, as shown by that space moving upwards, but also move and narrow its scope so as to reduce what generally would be termed social losses in that space. So the private sector effectively said, the state, you must take care of that. The consequence of this has been, but while this was happening in the late 70s, early 80s, we had a parallel and only marginally related process where you had some new technologies coming to bear, where, for example, cell phone technologies, the rise of things like microfinance and telemedicine, most of which were facilitated by already technologically driven processes. And so this was happening in parallel with the ideological shift which was taking place. And it's really from that space where the enterprise, we believe, emerges, where it moves from simply being charity to saying, how can we provide these social services, but do it in a way which is more efficient, which is more financially sustainable, and which uses a lot of the technology of the classic private enterprise, but devotes itself to a social mission. And this is something that we believe, certainly in the South African context, is becoming very important, because we have a chronic problem of what's called service delivery, etc., and the expectations of the broad masses of people. And who's stepping into the breach? It's primarily social enterprises that are doing it. And so rather than, and this is probably a little bit interesting for academics, the classic curve which said that you can't have it all, is really being replaced, partly driven by technology, by a new paradigm which talks about enterprises moving along what's called the sole consensus of shared growth, where in order to create financial capital, you have to be seen to be a socially responsible citizen. You have to be creating social capital to get that license. And we believe, we see what's emerging, certainly in South Africa and in lots of other places, is the development of enterprises, not along this curve anymore, primarily, but along this curve, which is the social entrepreneurial curve. Now this has a lot of implications for what one does in terms of policy for entrepreneurship, okay, but particularly, how do we underwrite the growth of social enterprises, which we believe is a prerequisite for development. You cannot have sustainable development if you don't increase the education, health, etc. outcomes of our people. And unless enterprises are being created which are addressing the MDGs and doing it in a way which is efficient and sustainably, we can't see how you can sustainably sustain the development agenda. We can't see how you're going to sustain job creation. So our efforts are really around how can we use entrepreneurship to create those policies, those constructs, and those organizations which will do that. And social enterprises, we believe, is a key bit of it, because the state is not participating in that space generally. And someone has to do it. And it's really the social enterprise which we see is the key to doing that.
What I want to do is just look at some of the statistics we were looking at yesterday, but drill them down into a South African context. And then just talk very briefly about social enterprise infrastructure and how that's developed. So from 2000, this shows from 2002 to 2010, the total entrepreneurial activity in that time in South Africa. And what you'll see is, apart from a dip in 2009, 2006 onwards, we've seen significant growth. Up to, well, yeah, just under 9%, which isn't high compared to other countries particularly, but we're seeing a sort of growth in the right direction. In terms of those that are involved in early stage entrepreneurial activity, breaking it down into the four main ethnic groups, you can see that the Black African community is the most entrepreneurial and the most represented in terms of those involved in early stage enterprise. Then the white community, then the coloured, and then the Indian and Asian community. Now, part of that is related to the size of the different ethnic groups in the country. But yeah, the majority of enterprise is happening amongst the Black South African community. There was a talk yesterday of motivated by opportunity and motivated by necessity, and the difference in those sort of enterprises. And what we've got here is just a sort of quick look at where we're seeing the split between the two over the course of a number of years. You'll see from 2004, so from the elections 2004 all the way down to 2008, the motivated by necessity group dropped dramatically. And there was a lot of opportunity there for entrepreneurial activity. But we've seen that rise slightly in the last couple of years. So South Africa's total entrepreneurial activity in 2006 was 5%, and then 2 years later has grown to 7.8%. But it's still significantly lower than other similar economies. So India, Brazil, Colombia, which is very high, and Mexico. And then in the US, it's 10.8. So we see that as an opportunity. There's opportunity for growth there. And just comparing particularly Brazil, which has a much higher percentage in terms of entrepreneurial activity, the index, Brazil is actually slightly lower than us in terms of the index, in terms of the... Kojo, help me out.
Yeah, essentially the Gini coefficient measures the level of inequality in society, and Brazil, South Africa is the most unequal society in the world now, slightly outpacing Brazil. But Brazil has a much higher level of entrepreneurial activity, particularly social entrepreneurial.
Yeah. And looking at the split between male and female entrepreneurship, so in South Africa it's 2.6 to 1, whereas somewhere like Chile, it's a ratio of 1 to 1. So there's a lot of opportunity there that hasn't yet been tapped into around women entrepreneurs. And in terms of early stage social entrepreneurial activity, in South Africa it's only 1.8%, compared to somewhere like Uganda, which would be 2.2. I don't know what it would be here in Kenya. I imagine it's probably much higher. South Africa is behind in that respect. And globally, we hear a lot about youth and social entrepreneurship. And again, that's a very low area of activity in South Africa. And again, we see that as another opportunity to mobilise young people into social entrepreneurial activity. And yeah, you can see there the social enterprise participation rates. So for Black Africans and whites, it's only 1.9%. And Indian communities 1.6, coloured community 1.4. So these are low figures. And certainly from an ASEN perspective, we see that as an opportunity to raise the profile of social entrepreneurship in the country and actually raise these figures up. In terms of the infrastructure around social enterprise, it's really over the last 3 or 4 years that we've begun to see in South Africa certain things come together and be put in place in terms of supporting social entrepreneurship. So the ILO undertook a programme 2008-2009 and brought quite a lot of money into the country to look specifically at social enterprise. And they developed a whole range of training materials around introduction to social enterprise, business planning, developing social enterprise, that their aim was to roll out across the country. And they ran a couple of business planning competitions for social entrepreneurs. The University of Johannesburg actually hosted the Social Enterprise World Forum last year, and they have a Centre for Social Entrepreneurship which was funded by our Department of Economic Development. That's now coming to an end, but that was almost the pioneer project, I think. But since then, a number of other universities have come on board. So obviously there's Witts with Kojo and the Centre for Entrepreneurship. UCT, the Graduate Business School, has a Centre for Social Innovation and Entrepreneurship that's funded by the BIEA Foundation, and that's based in the business school. Gibbs, as Kojo mentioned, has a certificate for social enterprise. That's the only accredited academic qualification in the country at the moment, as I understand it. I'm sure more will follow. The UCT and the Business School, the BIEA Centre, they provided 6 scholarships this last year for MBA students that wanted to focus on social entrepreneurship. And they've just launched now another 6 PhD scholarships around social enterprise. 3 years ago, the African Social Entrepreneurs Network was established with the vision to bring together social entrepreneurs and to raise the profile of social entrepreneurship. And as I mentioned briefly before, the Social Enterprise Academy Africa is now established as well, so bringing actual very practical training to social entrepreneurs. So whereas 3 years ago there were people talking about social entrepreneurship, academics were becoming interested in social entrepreneurship, actually we're now seeing a level of infrastructure there that wasn't there before in terms of member networks, training, more research. So that's a brief overview of the where we're at in terms of entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship in South Africa. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you.